What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world tried to erase you from existence? Rebecca Walsh thought she knew her husband, Jonathan, until she discovered $50,000 charged to their credit card for engagement rings she never received. When she confronted him about his affair, he suggested a romantic getaway to save their marriage. But standing on a cliff 3,000 feet above Yosemite Valley, pregnant with his child, Rebecca realized this wasn't a second honeymoon. It was her execution. This is the true story of betrayal, survival, and the terrifying lengths some people will go to for money. If stories of courage against impossible odds inspire you, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, you won't believe how this ends. Rebecca Walsh stared at her laptop screen in disbelief. The American Express statement showed a $50,000 charge at Tiffany & Company. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the details. The purchase date was last Tuesday. When Jonathan claimed he was in meetings all day, she grabbed her phone and called the store. "Hi, I'm calling about a recent purchase on my account. Could you tell me what was bought?" The sales associate hesitated. "Ma'am, I can see a platinum engagement ring and matching wedding band set. Very beautiful pieces. Your husband seems so excited about them." Rebecca's heart stopped. "Can you describe the woman he was with?" "Oh, she was lovely. Blonde, about 5'6", wearing a red dress. They seemed so happy together." The phone slipped from Rebecca's fingers. 6 months pregnant and discovering her husband was buying engagement rings for another woman. She rushed to the bathroom and vomited. Her morning sickness made worse by the crushing betrayal. When Jonathan came home that evening, Rebecca confronted him. She held up the credit card statement with shaking hands. $50,000 at Tiffany. Jonathan, care to explain? His face went pale for just a moment before his practiced smile returned. "Rebecca, sweetheart, you're overreacting. Those were client gifts, business expenses. You know how important it is to maintain relationships in my line of work. Client gifts that include engagement rings." Her voice cracked. "I called the store. Jonathan, they described the blonde woman you were with. They said you both seemed excited about the rings." Jonathan's expression hardened. "You called behind my back. That's incredibly inappropriate. Rebecca, you're emotional because of the pregnancy. You're not thinking clearly." The gaslighting was textbook perfect. Rebecca had seen enough episodes of true crime shows to recognize the tactics, but experiencing them firsthand felt different, more confusing, more devastating. "I'm not crazy," she whispered. "I know what I heard." "You're pregnant and stressed," Jonathan said, moving closer. His voice took on that soothing tone that once made her feel safe. "Your hormones are all over the place. You're imagining things that aren't there." But Rebecca wasn't imagining the way he stepped back when she tried to touch his hand. She wasn't imagining how he'd been working late every night for the past 3 months. She wasn't imagining the unfamiliar perfume that sometimes clung to his shirts. That night, as Jonathan slept beside her, Rebecca lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her hand rested on her growing belly, feeling the gentle movements of their unborn daughter. She'd been so excited about this pregnancy, so sure that a baby would bring them closer together. Instead, it seemed to be pushing him further away. The next morning, Jonathan left early for another business meeting. Rebecca waited until she heard his car pull out of the driveway, then searched his home office. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath old tax documents, she found a burner phone. Her fingers trembled as she turned it on. The message history made her blood run cold. Victoria Sterling, the real estate agent who'd helped them buy their house 2 years ago. Dozens of messages between them, dating back months. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Last night was incredible. When are you going to tell her I'm tired of hiding? The ring is perfect. I can't wait to be Mrs. Walsh." Rebecca read message after message, each one driving the knife deeper into her heart. They'd been planning this for months. Not just an affair, but a complete replacement of her life. The final message thread made her stomach lurch. "She's getting suspicious about the credit card. Don't worry, I have a plan. Once she's gone, everything will be ours." "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "Trust me, I'll handle everything." Rebecca screenshot the messages with her own phone. her heart pounding so hard she could barely think straight. Gone. What did he mean by gone? She thought about their upcoming anniversary trip to Yosemite National Park. Jonathan had suggested it suddenly last week, claiming they needed time to reconnect before the baby came. She'd been touched by the gesture. Now it felt like something else entirely. "You seem distracted lately," Victoria Sterling said, settling into the passenger seat of Jonathan's BMW. She wore a tight black dress that showcased the diamond engagement ring he'd bought her. "Is everything okay?" Jonathan glanced in the rearview mirror before pulling out of the parking garage. "Rebecca's getting suspicious." She found the credit card statement. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her thigh. "What did you tell her? That they were business gifts?" "She didn't buy it." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Don't worry. After this weekend, it won't matter what she thinks." "The Yosemite trip." Victoria's voice carried a note of excitement. "You're really going through with it." "It's perfect. Remote location, dangerous cliffs, tragic accident." Jonathan's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "A grieving widower will get plenty of sympathy and life insurance." Victoria shifted in her seat. "How much life insurance?" "2 million. Plus her trust fund becomes mine if she dies. We're talking about 5 million total." The numbers made Victoria's eyes gleam. "What about the baby?" "What about it? Problem solved." Jonathan pulled into the driveway of Victoria's condo. "After tomorrow, you and I can finally start our real life together." Victoria leaned over and kissed him. "I love you." "I love you too. Now go pack for our celebration trip. I'll call you tomorrow night when it's done." Meanwhile, Rebecca sat in her own car in the parking lot of her obstetrician's office. She'd just heard her daughter's heartbeat, strong and steady. The sound should have filled her with joy. Instead, all she could think about were those text messages. "Trust me, I'll handle everything." She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that Jonathan would never actually hurt her, but the cold calculation in his messages suggested otherwise. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd married, was planning something terrible. Rebecca pulled out her phone and called her sister in Portland. "Amy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise you'll listen without judgment." "Of course. What's wrong? You sound scared." "If something happens to me this weekend, I need you to know that it wasn't an accident." Amy's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" "Jonathan's having an affair. I found evidence, and I think he might try to hurt me." The words felt surreal coming out of her mouth. "Then don't go on the trip. Come here instead, bring whatever evidence you have, and we'll figure this out." "I can't. If I run now, he'll know I'm on to him. He might try something worse." Rebecca watched a young mother push a stroller across the parking lot. "But if something happens, look into Victoria Sterling. She's his. They're planning something to..." "Rebecca, please. I have to go. He'll be home soon, and I can't let him know I suspect anything." That evening, Jonathan came home with flowers and her favorite takeout from the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date. He was charming, attentive, asking about her doctor's appointment and rubbing her feet while they watched television. It was the most affectionate he'd been in months, and it terrified her. "I'm really looking forward to tomorrow," he said, his hand resting on her belly. "Just the two of us. Quality time before our lives change forever." Rebecca forced a smile. "Me too." But as they packed for Yosemite, Rebecca carefully slipped a small recording device into her jacket pocket. If Jonathan was planning what she thought he was planning, she wanted evidence. She wanted the world to know the truth about what really happened to her and her unborn daughter. The universal dilemma that keeps people awake at night isn't just about having enough money or finding love. It's about trust. How do you know when the person you've given your heart to has become the person who wants to destroy you? How do you tell the difference between paranoia and intuition? These are the questions that haunt anyone who's ever felt that cold chill of doubt about someone they love. Rebecca packed her bag, knowing she might not survive the weekend, but she also knew she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. One way or another, by Sunday evening, she would know the truth about the man she'd married. The drive to Yosemite took 4 hours. Jonathan kept up cheerful conversation the entire way, pointing out scenic views and talking about baby names. He played her favorite music and stopped at a roadside stand to buy her fresh strawberries. Rebecca smiled and nodded in all the right places, but her hand never left the recording device in her pocket. She'd turned it on the moment they left the house. "Look at that view," Jonathan said as they wound up the mountain road. "We should stop and take some pictures. The ones from the park website are beautiful." Rebecca replied carefully. "Have you been researching specific spots?" "Just want to make sure we see the best views. This might be our last trip for a while, with the baby coming." Last trip. The words sent ice through her veins. They checked into their hotel room in the late afternoon. Jonathan suggested they explore the area before dinner, maybe catch the sunset from one of the overlooks. "I found this amazing spot," he said, pulling up a map on his phone. "Taft Point. It's supposed to have incredible views, and it won't be crowded this time of day." Rebecca looked at the location. Remote, dangerous cliffs, no safety railings. Perfect for an accident. "That sounds wonderful," was she managed to say. They drove to the trailhead as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. The parking area was nearly empty, just as Jonathan had predicted. Rebecca's heart pounded as they walked the short trail to the overlook. Taft Point jutted out over the valley like a stone finger pointing into the void. The granite cliff dropped away into nothing, a sheer fall of more than 3,000 feet. The valley floor looked impossibly far below. "Wow," Rebecca breathed. Despite her fear, the view was genuinely spectacular. "It's beautiful. Perfect spot for photos," Jonathan said. He pulled out his phone. "Stand over there, near the edge. The light is perfect." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "I don't think I should get too close. You know how clumsy I've been lately with the pregnancy." "You'll be fine. I'll keep you safe." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Trust me. Trust me." The same words from his text messages. Rebecca moved toward the edge, but stopped several feet back. "How about here? Closer. The composition will be better." Jonathan stepped behind her, his hands on her shoulders. "Just a little more." She felt the pressure of his hands guiding her forward. Another step. Another. The edge was only 2 feet away now. "Jonathan, I think this is close enough." "Actually, Molly," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I think it's perfect." His hands moved from her shoulders to the center of her back. Rebecca felt the pressure increase, pushing her toward the cliff. "Jonathan, and what are you doing?" "What I should have done months ago." His voice was cold, completely different from the loving husband he'd been all day. "You're in the way. Rebecca, you and that baby. You're keeping me from the life I deserve." Rebecca tried to step backward, but his hands held her in place. "Please, don't do this. Think about our daughter." "I am thinking about her. I'm thinking about how much money her death will bring me." He leaned close to her ear. "I'm thinking about Victoria, and the life we're going to have together with your money." Rebecca reached into her pocket and pressed the record button, hoping the device was still working. "You're going to kill your own child. It's not my child anymore. It's just a problem that needs to be solved." With a sudden, violent shove, Jonathan pushed Rebecca toward the edge of the cliff. Time slowed as Rebecca felt herself falling forward. Her hands flew out, grasping desperately for anything to stop her momentum. Her fingers caught the rough bark of a twisted pine tree growing from a crack in the granite, just a few feet down from the edge. The impact nearly tore her arms from their sockets. Pain shot through her shoulders as her full weight jerked against the tree. The bark cut into her palms, and she could feel warm blood running down her wrists. "Help me!" she screamed, looking up at Jonathan's silhouette against the darkening sky. "Please, help me." Jonathan peered over the edge, his face emotionless. "Let go, Rebecca. It'll be easier if you just let go. I'm carrying your child." Tears streamed down her face. "How can you do this to us?" "Because neither of you matter anymore." He crouched down, bringing his face closer to hers. "Victoria's pregnant too. That's the child I want. You're just the mistake I'm correcting." Rebecca's grip slipped slightly on the tree trunk. Her arms were already shaking from the strain. "If you help me up, I'll disappear. I'll take the baby and leave. You'll never see us again." Jonathan laughed. "And give up $2 million in life insurance? I don't think so." He reached down toward her hands, not to help her up, but to pry her fingers loose from the tree. "Stop!" Rebecca screamed. Somebody help me! No one can hear you, Jonathan said calmly. I made sure of that. But he was wrong. Thomas Mitchell had been hiking alone, trying to clear his head after another 14-hour shift in the emergency room. The death of his wife in a car accident 6 months earlier had left him hollow, and the demanding work as a trauma surgeon was the only thing that kept him functional. He heard the scream echo across the canyon and immediately changed direction, running toward the sound. Rebecca's strength was failing. Her fingers were slick with blood, and the tree branch was starting to bend under her weight. She could feel herself slipping. Please, she whispered to her unborn daughter. Please hold on. Mommy's going to try to save us. Jonathan stood up, apparently satisfied that gravity would finish what he'd started. Goodbye, Rebecca. I'll make sure to speak beautifully at your funeral. He turned and walked back toward the parking area, leaving her hanging over the abyss. That's when Thomas reached the overlook. Jesus Christ, he breathed, seeing Rebecca's desperate situation. Hang on, I'm coming. Jonathan spun around, shocked. Who are you? This is a private family matter. Family matter. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. Your wife is hanging off a cliff. She fell. Tragic accident. I was just going to get help. Thomas looked between Jonathan's calm demeanor and Rebecca's obvious terror. Something was very wrong here. Help me pull her up, Thomas ordered. I don't think that's safe. We should wait for professional rescue. She'll be dead by then. Thomas moved to the edge and called down to Rebecca. I'm a doctor. I'm going to get you out of this. He pulled off his belt and lowered it toward her. Can you grab this? Rebecca looked up at the stranger with desperate hope. Please don't let me fall. I won't, I promise. Thomas braced himself and felt Rebecca's weight as she grasped the belt. Slowly, carefully, he pulled her up while she used her feet to walk up the cliff face. Jonathan watched in fury as his perfect plan unraveled. As soon as Rebecca's feet touched solid ground, he knew his life was over. Rebecca collapsed onto the granite, sobbing and clutching her belly. Thank you, she gasped. Thank you. Thomas immediately began examining her for injuries. Are you hurt? How far along are you? 6 months. I think I'm okay. The baby's still moving. Thomas looked at Jonathan with cold eyes. What kind of man watches his pregnant wife hanging off a cliff and doesn't help? You don't understand, Jonathan said desperately. She's been having emotional problems, suicidal thoughts. I was afraid she might jump if I got too close. That's a lie. Rebecca struggled to sit up. He pushed me. He tried to kill me. She's delusional, Jonathan insisted. The pregnancy has affected her mental state. Thomas studied both of them carefully. As a trauma surgeon, and he'd seen every kind of injury, every kind of violence. He'd also learned to read people in crisis situations. Rebecca was terrified, injured, but coherent. Jonathan was calm, controlled, and making excuses. We need to get you to a hospital, Thomas told Rebecca. Both of you should come with me. Of course, Jonathan said quickly. Whatever's best for Rebecca and the baby. But as they walked back to the parking area, Thomas noticed that Jonathan stayed as far away from his wife as possible. And when Rebecca tried to take his hand, Jonathan pulled away. Something was definitely wrong with this picture. At the hospital emergency room, Rebecca felt the first real sense of safety she'd experienced in hours. Thomas Mitchell had stayed with her during the drive, making sure she remained conscious and monitoring her vital signs. The baby's heartbeat is strong, and Elizabeth Harper announced after completing the ultrasound. No signs of distress. You're very lucky, Mrs. Walsh. Rebecca closed her eyes in relief. Thank you, God. Jonathan stood in the corner of the exam room, playing the concerned husband perfectly. Doctor, my wife has been under a lot of stress lately. She's been having some emotional difficulties. Dr. Harper glanced at him, then back at Rebecca. Is that true, Mrs. Walsh? No, Rebecca said firmly. My husband pushed me off that cliff. He tried to kill me and our baby. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Dr. Harper looked between the couple, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Doctor, Jonathan said, his voice heavy with sadness, Rebecca has been having paranoid delusions. I've been trying to get her help, but she refuses to see a psychiatrist. That's not true. Rebecca struggled to sit up. Check my phone. I have evidence of his affair, evidence that he's been planning this. Where's your phone? Dr. Harper asked. Rebecca's heart sank. It must have fallen when he pushed me. But I had a recording device. She reached into her jacket pocket, but it was empty. The device must have fallen out during her struggle to survive. I think my wife needs psychiatric evaluation, Jonathan said gently, for her own safety and the baby's. Thomas Mitchell had been listening from the hallway. Something about the husband's behavior bothered him. He'd seen genuine terror in Rebecca's eyes at the cliff and genuine relief when she'd been rescued. That wasn't the behavior of someone having delusions. He approached Dr. Harper. I'd like to speak with you privately. They stepped outside the room, leaving Rebecca alone with Jonathan for the first time since the cliff. You have no idea what you've done, Jonathan hissed, dropping his concerned husbandhood act. You should have died. It would have been cleaner. People will believe me, Rebecca whispered. Will they? A pregnant woman making wild accusations against her devoted husband. Jonathan smiled coldly. I'm a respected investment banker. You're an emotional pregnant woman who clearly fell off a cliff. Who do you think they'll believe? Dr. Harper returned with Tarman and a hospital administrator Rebecca didn't recognize. The administrator, a thin man in an expensive suit, shook Jonathan's hand warmly. Mr. Walsh, I'm Harold Brennan, the hospital administrator. Dr. Harper has explained the situation. I want you to know we'll take excellent care of your wife. I appreciate that. Harold, my family has donated significantly to this hospital over the years. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. Donated significantly. Jonathan had connections here. Given your wife's emotional state, Brennan continued, we think it would be best to place her under psychiatric observation for a few days, just to make sure she's stable. Wait, Thomas interrupted. That seems premature. She's just been through a traumatic experience. Dr. Mitchell, Brennan's voice carried a warning. I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. Mr. Walsh knows his wife's condition better than anyone. Rebecca watched in horror as the men discussed her fate as if she weren't in the room. You can't do this. I'm not mentally ill. My husband tried to murder me. The paranoid delusions are getting worse, Jonathan said sadly. I think the psychiatric hold is the right choice. Two orderlies appeared in the doorway. Rebecca realized with growing panic that they intended to take her to the psychiatric ward against her will. Please, she begged Thomas. You saw what happened. You know I'm telling the truth. Thomas met her eyes, and she saw belief there. But she also saw that he was powerless against the hospital's decision. This is wrong, he said quietly. Dr. Mitchell, Brennan's voice was firm. You're not the attending physician here. Please step aside. As the orderlies moved toward her bed, Rebecca felt the crushing weight of helplessness. No one was going to save her this time. Jonathan had outmaneuvered her completely. Within the hour, she was sedated and transferred to the psychiatric ward. Her phone, her freedom, and her credibility were gone, and Jonathan Walsh walked out of the hospital a free man. The psychiatric ward smelled like disinfectant and despair. Rebecca woke up groggy from the sedatives, her head pounding and her mouth dry. She was in a small room with a single window that looked out onto the hospital parking lot. A nurse entered carrying a medication cup. Time for your pills, Mrs. Walsh. What are they? Antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. Doctor's orders. I don't need those. I'm not psychotic. Rebecca pushed the cup away. I need to speak to someone in charge. My husband tried to kill me. The nurse, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, gave her a sympathetic but disbelieving look. That's what you told the doctors yesterday. Mrs. Walsh, you fell off a cliff. Trauma can sometimes cause confusion about what really happened. I didn't fall. I was pushed. Rebecca's voice rose in frustration. Why won't anyone listen to me? I'm listening, but right now, you need to focus on getting better. The nurse held out the medication cup again. These will help with the paranoid thoughts. They're not paranoid if they're true. The nurse pressed a button on the wall, and the two orderlies appeared. Mrs. Walsh, you can take the medication voluntarily, or we can administer it by injection. Your choice, boss. Rebecca looked at the three people surrounding her bed and realized she had no power here. None at all. She took the pills and swallowed them, feeling them lodge in her throat like stones. Good. The doctor will be in to see you this afternoon. Alone again, Rebecca tried to think clearly despite the fog settling over her mind. She needed help. But who would believe her Jonathan had played this perfectly? The devoted husband whose pregnant wife had a mental breakdown and tried to kill herself? She thought about her sister Amy in Portland. Amy would believe her. But how could she contact her from here that afternoon? Dr. Patricia Reeves, the staff psychiatrist, came to evaluate her. She was a kind-looking woman with graying hair and gentle eyes. Mrs. Walsh, I understand you have been through a very traumatic experience. Can you tell me what you remember about yesterday? Rebecca took a deep breath and tried to speak calmly, rationally. My husband pushed me off a cliff at Taft Point in Yosemite. He's having an affair with a woman named Victoria Sterling, and they plan to kill me for my life insurance. John Reeves made notes without looking up. Have you ever experienced paranoid thoughts before? These aren't paranoid thoughts. They're facts. Rebecca fought against the medication making her drowsy. If you check his phone, you'll find text messages between him and Victoria. Mr. Walsh has been very cooperative. He's shown us his phone records. There are no suspicious communications. Of course, Jonathan had ditched into the burner phone by now. He had a second phone, a burner phone. Mrs. Walsh, I know this is difficult, but sometimes severe stress can cause our minds to create explanations for traumatic events. It's not uncommon for accident victims to believe someone intentionally hurt them. Rebecca stared at the ceiling, feeling hope drain away like water through a sieve. Every word she said to defend herself only made her sound more delusional. How long do I have to stay here? That depends on your progress. Your husband has initiated guardianship proceedings, given your current mental state. Guardianship? Rebecca bolted upright, adrenaline cutting through the medication fog. He can't do that. I'm afraid he can, if the court determines you're unable to care for yourself or make rational decisions. Rebecca felt the walls closing in. If Jonathan became her legal guardian, he would control every aspect of her life, her medical care, her finances, even her ability to see the baby after it was born. This was worse than death. This was being buried alive. That evening, she had an unexpected visitor. Thomas Mitchell appeared in her doorway, still wearing scrubs from the hospital. Dr. Mitchell, she struggled to sit up. What are you doing here? I wanted to check on you. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down. How are you feeling? Like I'm in a nightmare I can't wake up from. Tears began flowing down her cheeks. No one believes me. They think I'm crazy. Thomas studied her face carefully. I believe you. Rebecca's heart lurched. You do? I've been thinking about what happened at the cliff. Your husband's reaction wasn't normal. When I see someone I love in danger, my first instinct is to help them, not make excuses about why I can't. But everyone else wasn't there. Thomas leaned forward. I saw his face. Rebecca, I saw how calm he was while you were hanging over that cliff. That's not how people react when their pregnant wife nearly dies. For the first time in days, Rebecca felt like she could breathe. Someone believed her. Someone saw the truth. Can you help me get out of here? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to try, but it won't be easy. Your husband has a lot of influence in this hospital. I know, he mentioned donations. He's also been very convincing about your mental state. But I'm a doctor too, and I know the difference between trauma and delusion. Thomas stood up. Don't give up, Rebecca. The truth has a way of coming out. After he left, Rebecca lay in the dark feeling the first spark of hope she'd had since the cliff. Thomas believed her, and if one person could see the truth, maybe others could too. But she had no idea that Jonathan's plan was about to get much worse. 3 days later, Rebecca woke to find Victoria Sterling sitting in the chair beside her bed. The blonde woman looked radiant in a cream-colored dress, her engagement ring sparkling in the morning light. Hello, Rebecca. Victoria's voice was sickeningly sweet. I thought it was time we had a proper chat. Rebecca tried to sit up, but the medications made her movements slow and clumsy. What are you doing here? Visiting the poor, delusional woman who's been spreading lies about my fiancé. Victoria crossed her legs and smiled. The doctors tell me you've been claiming Jonathan tried to kill you. Because he did. Oh, honey, Victoria laughed softly. Nobody believes that. Jonathan is such a caring husband, staying by your side through this mental breakdown. Rebecca's head was swimming from the drugs, but she forced herself to focus. I found your text messages. I know about your affair. And what text messages? Jonathan showed me his phone. There's nothing suspicious there. The burner phone? Victoria's smile widened. There's no burner phone, Rebecca. That's just another delusion. She leaned forward conspiratorially. But I'll tell you what's real. I'm pregnant with Jonathan's baby. 4 months along. A little boy. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. You're lying. Am I? Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Rebecca an ultrasound image. We found out the gender yesterday. Jonathan is so excited about having a son. Rebecca stared at the ultrasound photo, feeling her world crumble further. He doesn't want our daughter. Of course not. Why would he want a child with a mentally ill woman? Victoria put her phone away. Don't worry, though. After the baby is born, we'll make sure she goes to a good family. Jonathan has no intention of raising another man's child. Another man's child. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. Come on, Rebecca. You don't really think that baby is Jonathan's, do you? He told me all about your affair with your yoga instructor. Very disappointing behavior for a married woman. Rebecca tried to process what she was hearing. I never had an affair. That baby is Jonathan's. That's not what the paternity test will show. Victoria stood up, smoothing her dress. Jonathan is very good at covering his tracks. When that baby is born, the DNA test will prove it's not his, and then he'll have every right to walk away from both of you. The room spun around Rebecca, even through the medication haze. She understood what Victoria was telling her. Jonathan had planned everything down to the last detail. Not just her death, but her complete destruction. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand how thoroughly you've lost. Victoria walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Jonathan is filing for divorce on grounds of adultery and mental incompetence. He'll get everything, the house, the money, even custody of the baby if the court decides you're an unfit mother. No court would give a baby to a man who tried to kill its mother. What man who tried to kill its mother anyone sees as a devoted husband trying to care for his mentally ill wife? Victoria turned back to Rebecca with cold eyes. You fell off a cliff, Rebecca. You had a psychotic break. Those are the facts everyone believes. A shared experience that haunts anyone who's ever felt powerless is the moment you realize that truth doesn't always matter. Sometimes perception becomes reality, and the story that sounds most believable wins. Regardless of what actually happened, this is the nightmare that keeps victims of abuse awake at night. The fear that no one will believe them when they finally find the courage to speak. By the way, Victoria added, heading for the door, I thought you should know that Jonathan and I are getting married next month. A small ceremony, given the tragic circumstances with his poor, unstable wife. I'm still alive, Rebecca said desperately. Are you, though? Victoria paused in the doorway. Legally, socially, financially, you might as well be dead. And soon, that won't just be a metaphor. After Victoria left, Rebecca lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every escape route was blocked. Every ally turned against her. Jonathan had built a perfect prison around her, and she was running out of time. But she still had one thing left. Her baby. Her daughter was still alive inside her, still fighting. And as long as her child lived, Rebecca would keep fighting Moo. Thomas Mitchell couldn't sleep. For 3 days, he'd been thinking about Rebecca Walsh and the terror in her eyes at the cliff. As a trauma surgeon, he'd developed an instinct for reading people in crisis situations. His gut told him she was telling the truth, but proving it was another matter entirely. He spent his off hours researching Jonathan Walsh, investment banker, philanthropist, member of several prestigious social clubs. His reputation was spotless. On paper, he looked like the perfect husband, but Thomas had learned not to trust perfect reputations. Late Thursday night, he used his hospital access to review Rebecca's medical files. What he found made his blood run cold. She'd been given heavy doses of antipsychotic medication despite showing no signs of psychosis. Her coherent behavior and rational responses were documented even as the psychiatrist maintained her diagnosis of paranoid delusion. Most disturbing was a note from Harold Brennan, the hospital administrator. recommending that Rebecca remain under psychiatric hold indefinitely for her own safety. Thomas recognized a cover-up when he saw one. The next morning, he waited until the psychiatric ward was during shift change, then slipped into Rebecca's room. She was awake but groggy from the medications. "Rebecca," he whispered urgently, "I need to get you out of here." She struggled to focus on his face. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" "Your husband is planning something worse. I overheard him talking to the administrator about transferring you to a long-term psychiatric facility." Fear cut through the medication fog. "He can't do that." "He can if the court grants him guardianship. The hearing is scheduled for Monday." Thomas helped her sit up. "We need to move tonight." "How the doors are locked? There are cameras everywhere." "I know this hospital inside and out. During the midnight shift change, there's a 15-minute window when the psychiatric ward is minimally staffed." Thomas pulled a small bag from his jacket. "I brought you street clothes and a wig. Can you walk?" Rebecca tested her legs. The medications made her unsteady, but determination gave her strength. "I'll manage." "Good. We have one chance to get this right." At 11:45 that night, Rebecca lay in bed pretending to sleep while listening for Thomas's signal. At exactly midnight, she heard a soft tap on her window. Moving as quietly as possible, she changed into the clothes Thomas had brought and put on the brown wig that concealed her blonde hair. Her hands shook as she opened her door and peered into the hallway. Empty. Thomas appeared at the end of the corridor, dressed in scrubs and looking like he belonged there. He gestured for her to follow him. They moved through the hospital like ghosts, using service elevators and back corridors. Thomas's knowledge of the building was perfect. Every turn, every door, every security camera was calculated. In the parking garage, Thomas led her to a beat-up Honda Civic instead of his usual BMW. "Borrowed from a friend," he explained as they drove out of the hospital. "Your husband will be looking for my car." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe while we figure out how to prove your story." "Thomas, why are you doing this? You barely know me." He was quiet for a long moment. 6 months ago, my wife died in a car accident. I was at the hospital when it happened. By the time I got to the scene, she was already gone." His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you." They drove through the night toward an uncertain future. Behind them, Jonathan's perfect plan was beginning to unravel. But ahead of them lay dangers neither of them could imagine. Because when a man has everything to lose, he becomes capable of anything. Rebecca and Thomas spent the next 2 days in a small motel outside the city, planning their next move. The medications were wearing off, and Rebecca's mind was sharp again for the first time in a week. "We need irrefutable proof," Thomas said, studying printouts of Jonathan's financial records that his lawyer friend had obtained. "Something that can't be explained away or dismissed. The only proof was on that burner phone, and he's probably destroyed it by now." Rebecca paced the small room, her hand resting on her belly. "How do we prove something that officially never existed?" Thomas looked up from the papers. "What if we make him prove it himself?" "What do you mean?" "What if we force him to reveal his true nature in a way that can't be denied?" Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, Thomas's phone rang. It was Elizabeth Harper from the hospital. "Thomas, where is Rebecca Walsh? She's missing from the psychiatric ward, and her husband is frantic." "I'm sure he is," Thomas said dryly. "This is serious. If you know where she is, you need to bring her back. She could be dangerous to herself or others." "Dr. Harper, what if I told you that Rebecca's story is true, that her husband really did try to kill her?" There was a long pause. "Thomas, I know you want to help, but you can't let your emotions cloud your judgment." "My emotions?" Thomas looked at Rebecca, seeing the hope and desperation in her eyes. "Check the security footage from the hospital parking lot. Look for Victoria Sterling visiting Rebecca 3 days ago." Another pause. "How do you know about that visit?" "Because Rebecca told me, and if Victoria Sterling exists, if she really is pregnant with Jonathan's child, then maybe Rebecca isn't delusional after all." Harper's voice was uncertain. "I'll check the footage. And Dr. Harper, look up Victoria Sterling's real estate license. Look up Jonathan Walsh's recent purchases at Tiffany and Company. Look up the life insurance policies on Rebecca's life." Thomas hung up and turned to Rebecca. "We're going to force their hand." Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Thomas would contact Jonathan directly, claiming that Rebecca had contacted him and threatened to expose the truth. He would arrange a meeting, ostensibly to negotiate Rebecca's return. But Rebecca would be there too, hidden and recording everything. If we can get him to admit what he did, in his own words, with video evidence, Thomas trailed off. It's dangerous, Rebecca said. If he suspects a trap, then we make sure he doesn't suspect anything until it's too late. That evening, Thomas called Jonathan. Mr. Walsh, this is Dr. Thomas Mitchell. I have information about your wife. Jonathan's voice was tight with controlled anger. Where is she, if you're hiding her? She contacted me. She wants to make a deal. What kind of deal? She'll come back voluntarily, accept a psychiatric treatment, even agree to the divorce. But she wants assurance that she'll have visitation rights with the baby. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Where is she now? She's scared, Mr. Walsh. She keeps talking about you pushing her off that cliff. I think the trauma has caused some false memories. Yes, that's exactly what happened. The trauma. Jonathan's voice grew warmer. Where can we meet? I just want my wife to get the help she needs. They arranged to meet at a parking structure downtown. Thomas would bring Rebecca. Jonathan would bring his lawyer and the necessary paperwork to have her recommitted. What Jonathan didn't know was that Rebecca would be in the trunk of Thomas's car with a video camera, recording everything through a modified taillight. The next evening, as they drove to the meeting, Rebecca felt her daughter kicking inside her, strong, steady movements that reminded her why she was fighting. Whatever happens, she told Thomas, promise me you'll protect my baby. Nothing's going to happen to either of you, Thomas replied, but his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. At the parking structure, Jonathan waited with another man in an expensive suit. Victoria Sterling stood beside him, her pregnancy now visible beneath her designer dress. Thomas parked and got out, leaving the engine running. Where is she? Jonathan demanded. She's scared to come out. She thinks you're going to hurt her again. Again, Jonathan's mask slipped slightly. I've never hurt my wife. She fell off that cliff. Right, she fell. Thomas crossed his arms. Funny thing, though, I've been thinking about that day, about how calm you were while she was hanging there. I was in shock. People react differently to trauma. Victoria stepped forward. Where is Rebecca? We don't have time for games. Why don't you tell me why you're here? Victoria, Thomas asked. What's your relationship to Miss Walsh? I'm his real estate agent. I'm here to help negotiate Rebecca's return. Is that all you are, his real estate agent? Jonathan's face darkened. What are you implying? In the trunk of the car. Rebecca held her breath as she recorded through the tiny camera lens. This was it, the moment of truth. I'm not implying anything, Thomas said. I'm asking directly. Are you having an affair with this man while his pregnant wife is locked in a psychiatric ward? That's an outrageous accusation, the lawyer interrupted. But Victoria's composure cracked. Jonathan, let's just get Rebecca and go. Yes, Jonathan said coldly. Let's get Rebecca. Where is she? Dr. Mitchell. Thomas smiled. She's closer than you think. That's when Rebecca kicked out the taillight and emerged from the trunk with the camera still rolling. The look of shock and rage on Jonathan's face was everything she'd hoped for. Hello, husband, she said, ready to tell the truth. The video Rebecca captured that night became the smoking gun that destroyed Jonathan's carefully constructed lies. In his fury at being deceived, he'd revealed everything. His affair with Victoria, his plan to kill Rebecca for the insurance money, even his intention to fake a paternity test to avoid responsibility for their daughter. You should have died on that cliff, he'd snarled at Rebecca while the camera rolled. Everything would have been perfect if you just died like you were supposed to. Victoria's panicked confession sealed their fate. Faced with evidence of conspiracy and attempted murder, she broke down completely, admitting to her role in planning Rebecca's death. Within hours, both Jonathan and Victoria were arrested. The video went viral on social media, generating nationwide outrage over domestic violence and the failure of institutions to protect victims. 6 months later, Rebecca sat in a federal courtroom holding her 3-month-old daughter. Emma, Jonathan had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for attempted murder and conspiracy. Victoria received 15 years for her role in the plot. Thomas Mitchell sat beside Rebecca, legally recognized as Emma's adoptive father after DNA tests proved Jonathan had tried to falsify paternity results. "Mrs. Mitchell," the prosecutor said, "would you like to make a victim impact statement?" Rebecca stood slowly, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Your Honor, 6 months ago my husband tried to comb me and our unborn child for money. He nearly succeeded, not just in murdering us, but in making the world believe I was mentally ill." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But I survived. My daughter survived. And today, justice has survived too." She looked directly at Jonathan, who sat in shackles at the defendant's table. "You tried to erase me from this world, but instead you erased yourself. My daughter will grow up knowing that her mother fought for her life and won." The judge nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Mitchell, your courage in exposing this conspiracy has undoubtedly saved other lives. This court commends you for your strength." Later, outside the courthouse, Rebecca and Thomas faced a crowd of reporters. "Mrs. Mitchell, what would you say to other women who might be experiencing domestic violence?" Rebecca adjusted Emma in her arms and spoke directly to the cameras. "Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone convince you that you're imagining abuse or manipulation." She paused, thinking of the wisdom that had carried her through the darkest moments. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. Sometimes you have to fight for that truth, but it's always worth fighting for. "What are your plans now?" Thomas stepped forward, wrapping his arm around Rebecca's shoulders. "We're starting a foundation to help domestic violence victims navigate the legal system and get the support they need. No one should have to face what Rebecca faced alone." A year later, Rebecca and Thomas were married in a small ceremony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Emma took her first steps across the beach sand while her parents watched with tears of joy. Rebecca often thought about that night on the cliff, hanging over the abyss while Jonathan walked away. She thought about the choice between giving up and fighting for one more moment, one more breath, one more chance. The wisdom she'd gained was simple but profound. Sometimes the difference between survival and surrender is measured in seconds. Sometimes hope arrives in the form of a stranger who chooses to help. Sometimes the truth needs a voice brave enough to speak it, no matter the cost. Most importantly, she'd learned that love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who believes you're already complete and chooses to build a life alongside you anyway. As she watched Emma chase seagulls along the shoreline while Thomas built sandcastles, Rebecca knew she'd found something better than the fairy tale she'd once believed in. She'd found something real. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, vast and full of possibilities. Behind them, the cliff where her old life had ended rose against the sky like a monument to survival. Rebecca Walsh Mitchell had fallen from that cliff, broken and alone. She'd risen from it whole and loved. And that, she knew, was the difference between existing and truly living. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. Sometimes surviving is just the first step toward thriving. Sometimes the cliff that was meant to destroy you becomes the place where you learn to fly.